science than what have already been presented that at least you might consider as being effective tools in the struggle to make sure that the environment of Vieques is well protected. So with that in mind, I'd like to share with you these ideas. Our attitude as Homo sapiens towards nature is quite ambivalent, and it can be applied, this human ecosystem idea, to Vieques, of course. The ecosystem concept, we need to go back and have a fresh kind of revisit of the ecosystem concept. This is Sir Arthur Tansley. He invented the term, and this is the first time it was ever used in the literature. By the way, Tansley went on, dropped biology, dropped ecology, and studied psychoanalysis with Freud toward the end of his career. And the original ecologists used lakes as laboratories, and their first set of models were models of the Victor Shelford model. Look, it's all parts. That the first step to understanding ecosystems was to name the parts. Squirrels, mice, insects, rabbits, toads, and no people. And no people. Well, this became the next step in ecosystem ecology, and it's one of the most powerful advances in the history of ecosystem ecology. It's the trophic dynamic model, the Lindemann trophic dynamic model. And in the center of this model is the wonderful variable called ooze. And I'm trained as a social scientist, and whenever my hard scientist, biological physics friends begin to talk about hard versus soft science, I remind them of this important model and the central variable of ooze. What's important about it is it's the first one that moved ecology from naming the parts to naming the parts and the flows, to linking parts and flows together. And that was a significant advance in how ecosystems could be considered. This is the model that we have been working on with colleagues Bill Birch at Yale, Jo Ellen Force at the University of Idaho, and others. And when you first take a look at it, remember that Shelford model, you go, oh my gosh, what's all this words? There's about 50 variables in there. To put that in perspective, a 1970 Ford pickup 150 has 5 indicator lights. 5 things. A Cessna has about 50. A 747 has 500, and the shuttle has about 5,000. This is, to understand the complexity of the human ecosystem, is about at the level of a Cessna. And it is not as complicated as it first appears. I printed this out for everyone, first so that you could keep me honest in my presentation, and second is then you wouldn't have to stare at these little images quite so much. This model has been applied. We've applied it pretty much in maybe 15, 20 different cases around the world, from China on giant panda to the Galapagos Islands, Singapore, Bangkok, under climate change, a whole range of different places. It could be applied to Vieques. We could consider Vieques a human ecosystem. And if we did that, if we considered Vieques a human ecosystem using this model, what might we learn? Well, first we'd have to keep track of all the biophysical resources. And we've talked about that a lot here. For example, we'd have to keep track of energy flows on an island where energy once came by batch, now comes constant, and can be batch and constant, which makes huge differences in how people use energy. We'd have to keep track of air and water, as we've just described. We'd have to keep track of land and flora, fauna, nutrients, and materials. And all of those would have to be documented at some level to try to understand the biophysical resources of Vieques. But biophysical resources extend to what's there, like the materials that we've been talking about. And it's not enough to just understand the biophysical resources, for there are socioeconomic resources that are needed to understand as well. Whether that's the flow of information, whether that is labor, whether that is population, capital, and capital expressed as investments, or capital expressed as true cash held, and of course technology. But there is also cultural resources. Human ecosystems are not just biophysical, they're sociocultural. And there are cultural resources. And the reason you call them cultural resources is people go to them for answers or for values or for support of their ideologies to make them feel clear about what their future is and what they can do. They're answers to what is often unanswerable questions. And they matter. Whether it's the importance of organization, how could you understand Vieques as a human ecosystem if you weren't prepared to understand the role of the churches? You would have to understand both the mythology of the struggle and the reality of the struggle with the Navy. And those two are not the same. They are not the same. And as the struggle recedes in history, a new generation of Viequenses who weren't part of the struggle, then you'll see the factual history of the struggle disappear into the mist as mythology takes over, as happens anywhere else. As happens anywhere else. But we would have to understand the importance of that myth, and we would have to understand art and craft, all those kinds of things, including beliefs. It's fascinating that how much of the behavior of the politicians and the institutions that we've been talking about is a function of you begin with this belief and then the science sort of follows it. And we may want to talk about the dangers inherent in that. But just understanding those critical resources is not enough. We'd have to understand Vieques as including a set of social institutions, whether it's the importance of the family, certainly in many cases, when we talk about individual consumption, we're really talking about household consumption. And that's a huge difference in the distribution and potential health effects if you're looking at households versus individuals. We'd have to understand about the delivery of education on Vieques. We'd have to understand about the economy of Vieques. We'd have to understand politics, and not just the politics of the powerful, but the politics of the less than powerful fighting back. So politics is not just the rote policies written by the legal people. It is also the resistance to that caused in response. We'd have to understand it. And certainly we'd have to understand the role of the tourist community. As Vieques moves into a 21st century, the proportion of persons living on the island who were part of the struggle, who are Viequense born, who were there during the exposure, is going to decline and decline and decline as a whole generation of continentals begin to see Vieques as a place to go, to retire, to move, and that will alter everything from Viequense health effects to the diets that we talked about just a few moments ago, to the economy of Vieques. And of course we would have to understand the role of defense and security on the broader scale, its impact on Vieques. And others have said it more eloquently than I. But not only that, we have to understand timing cycles. Anyone who wants to look at Vieques as an ecosystem has to see it not just distributed in space, but over time, and do that simultaneously. There's physiological cycles, there's market cycles, there are daily life cycles, biological and environmental cycles in terms of seasons and fruiting times. The phenology of Vieques is changing, and with that comes a whole set of additional problems. And then there are the larger life cycles of birth and death that have a huge impact. As I was saying to a few of you during a break, with the Navy's abandoning Vieques in 2003 and stopping the bombing slightly before that, and the birth patterns on Vieques, within 5, certainly to 10 years, a second generation of Viequenses will be born who did not live under the exposure of the actual bombing. Now, they might be under the airbursts, but it's a very different thing. And we will find ourselves with a 2-generation gap between the exposure during the bombing and a new generation of Viequenses, and the health impacts are going to get more complicated to understand. What if, for example, this new generation in about 5 years has the same kinds of health problems, but did not have the exposures? Then something else is going on. And what if they don't have those health problems? Is that evidence that it was at a particular point in time? My argument is that time is one of the most critical variables in trying to understand Vieques as an ecosystem. And there's longer cycles. There's longer cycles. Watch what happens as the bunkers slowly age. Not just now, but add 10 years. Now add 50 years. Now wait till the archaeologists of the future come back and try to understand what ancient gods we were celebrating when we built these things.
Yeah, I know.
And there are even longer cycles. Yes, ordnance and the chemical impacts are an important impact on the future of Vieques, but so is climate change, the volatility of storms, the increase in hurricane frequency and intensity. There are even larger forces at work that are impacting Vieques, and we have to understand them as well. And if we knew all that, is that enough? No, because there's still some social rules for how everyone on Vieques behaves with each other and toward each other. So we'd have to understand who owns what territory and who does not, who has power over territory and who does not. We'd have to understand rules. I put this in as one of my favorite pictures because there is a very elaborate rule, subtle and elaborate, on how you can line up to get on the ferry to go from Fajardo to Vieques. And for someone who had just moved there, burdened down with pots and pans and things to take to their little house, I didn't understand the rules. And several more matronly members of the Vieques community were very helpful in forcefully teaching me the social rules of how to line up. And if we understood all those parts, is that enough? No, because essentially that's just going back to the Shelford model of squirrels, nuts, toads, and birds. We have to understand the flows, and there are 6 different flows, and look on that sheet at the bottom, because my suggestion is we make a mistake if we only look at one or at the most 2 of those flows. All 6 are critical. The flow of individuals, and I don't mean just Homo sapiens, energy, nutrients, materials, information, and capital. And until we actually try to document the flow of those 6 flows, we don't really understand Vieques as a human ecosystem. So there are definitely flows of persons. There are flows of foodstuffs. And all of those, if we had all those variables, that's Cessna worth of variables, part of the problem is ecosystems are nested in context with one another, because not only could you look at Vieques as a human ecosystem, you could look at certain portions of Vieques, like Puerto Mosquito, as a specific human ecosystem. So, for example, it begins, of course, with the dinoflagellates that are the cause of much of that social systems operation, and the result of the bioluminescence that comes from that, the result of the tourism based on the bioluminescence, based on the dinoflagellate, and of course the impacts of development. These things are happening on top of one another. So, for example, as the homes begin to light up the hillside up to in front of where Puerto Mosquito is, the light pollution has its own impact, and it's an intriguing problem because, of course, there's a human settlement area near Puerto Mosquito. There's not near Portaferro, and yet the bioluminescence, which is much higher here due to a whole set of ecological factors compared to Portaferro, is a natural experiment waiting to understand the impact of human ecosystems upon Vieques. There, for example, is the view down to where the light pollution is having its most effect. And you can begin to model these things, the relationship between human settlement, toxin transport into the bay, dinoflagellate. My point is not that Mosquito Bay is a particularly important problem? It could be, but that's not the point. The point is that we can begin to model human ecosystems where biophysical variables and socioeconomic variables on Vieques are linked together from the beginning, linked together in an interdisciplinary way. Now, how do you do that? How do you get that done in the real world? I want to shift from this theoretical argument of Vieques as a human ecosystem to some suggestions to consider in terms of making progress on science, environment, and the future of Vieques. This is my argument to you, that the potential guiding principles for environmental management are most successful when they are based on these three principles. The first is best available sound science. And I do not, this is important, I didn't say best available science. Because if the best available science is poorly done, has poor sampling methods or poor protocols or poor data collection or poor chain of control, it's still not useful. Just because it's the best doesn't mean it's usable. Likewise, it has to be sound science. It isn't just that it's the very best, it has to meet that quality. And for Vieques deserves and requires the very best science. I understand your frustration that you don't have the money to do the kinds of analysis on diet that's there. But I would argue strongly to this group that the recommendations we put forth, if we say, well, we'd like to do it this rigorous way, but we just don't have the money, so we're going to propose a less disciplined, less vigorous way, we are making a serious political mistake and policy mistake, let alone a scientific mistake. Best available sound science. The second is for all of us in the scientific community to realize something very clear. These decisions are not scientific decisions. They are not science-based. And any of us who want it to be science-based, find an alternative universe run by scientists. At the best, it can be science-informed. That's the best we can ask for, is science-informed. And that is partly because there is a responsibility by land managers, whether it's Fish and Wildlife Service, whether it's the National Park Service or others, to follow an accurate fidelity to the law. We are still in a place where we have to follow the law. And you may come up with scientific recommendations or want to do scientific research in a certain way, but if it is against the law, we lose. The scientists lose. It has to be accurate fidelity to the law. And the third is long-term public interest, and the key is long-term. I sometimes wish we had borrowed one key thing from the Iroquois Confederation, who argued that good, important decisions are best made when you think 7 generations in the future. 7 generations. Imagine how the ordinance might have been dealt with in 2003 or even 1953 if we had been thinking 7 generations in the future what's going to happen. Well, my argument is it's not too late to start now for us to be thinking in terms of Vieques 7 generations away. And long-term public interest includes both the professional judgment of those in power, you have to accept that those that are in power have legitimate authority to apply professional judgment, but also what is in the true public's interest broadly, not just special interests, and certainly not the minor special interests of this generation alone. Long-term public interest extends beyond this generation. Those are the 3 guiding principles, and you can see that science has a critical role, but it is not the sole or defining one. If we applied all that to Vieques, and we did some very specific things regarding our approach to science, and I have a few modest suggestions, I think we could get somewhere. One thing we need is a much broader range of scientists involved. I think it's wonderful that so many of us who passionately care about Vieques, who live close at hand, who are involved in the struggle, are involved. But that is not sufficient for the challenges of science on Vieques. And we need to build a broader consortium so that the disenchanted, so those that do not particularly care about Vieques but care about science, also are contributing. And I argue that our real challenge is not just science for Vieques, but Vieques for science. And if you can do both of those things, then you begin to advance the base of knowledge that will actually lead to change. Several of us, Jorge included, playing a critical role, have argued for and developed a proposal to establish a scientific research station on Vieques, not just to study the issues of political importance, but rather to be a place of science for Vieques and Vieques for science. The argument's straightforward. A research station on Vieques would enable researchers and students from Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, North America, and elsewhere to conduct a wide range of scientific activities on Vieques. Not just health research, but health research embedded in a bigger agenda of biological diversity research, climate change research, anthropological research. It would employ local persons. It would help educate local students, and it would provide what I call usable knowledge to local governments and stakeholder groups, support the island's economy, and increase awareness of Vieques worldwide. Several years ago, a major article on climate was published in Science. It was the feature article in Science. And the data was collected by core samples on the beaches of Vieques. And the photograph that they put on the cover of Science was of a grain of sand. I was so mad. Because no one understood the role that Vieques played in understanding climate change. A research station would draw all over this world, and I have worked at several research stations, like in Galapagos, at the Darwin Center, etc., and increase Vieques' worldwide awareness. Again, science that benefits Vieques, but Vieques that benefits science. And I believe that if such a research station is built, and we actually have business plans and locations figured out, all that kind of stuff, it has to be economically, culturally, and ecologically sustainable. Both benefits have to be there. That will require extreme political bravery by the scientific community, because it means that we don't just do the studies that Jim wants, or that Gary wants, or that Jorge wants. That instead, it is a research station open to all to do research there at a high level of rigor and deliver the results as they come. And that requires a confidence in the long term that I would urge we have. If we did that, if we built such a place, they will come. They will come. And when they do, Vieques will benefit. That kind of research will be helpful to us. And if we do that, then the most we can hope for is to build the base of best available sound science. And if we do that, we are delivering our task to the decision makers, who then have to mix it with accurate fidelity to the law and long-term public interest, and actually achieve the very goals that have been argued so eloquently here. That's my pitch. Any questions or comments?
So Gary, is this Vieques here?
That's Vieques.
Yeah.
That is it.
Yep.
And can you indicate how much of Vieques is open?
What does open mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Because, for example, much of the refuge, only the small parts of it are open. And so even the definition, remember I showed that slide of closed and open? Even figuring out the territory of what's open is very difficult to do. And by the way, there's a lot of private land that's not open, that's available to others. Someone else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, very nice overview. And I think the framework that has evolved from a colleague that we both know well is alive and well in your genes. I have a couple of thoughts, and one is it seems really important, given just the enormous diversity of issues that you're raising, for this group to become very strategic in the nature of the questions that we ask. And it strikes me that we need to think about articulating those questions in a way that is hierarchical to certain critical problems that people on the island face. And for that reason, I think that there are some that might be interesting to explore over at others that strike me as being very critical to making reasonable recommendations about how to reduce exposure to those that are in special need over the short term. So a second area that I hope was dealt with in the policy group, I wasn't part of the group this afternoon, obviously, would be thinking about research that's necessary over the short run to identify critical points of intervention to provide services on the island that are not now there, as a way of launching a research effort, so to speak, to see if disease incidence could diminish. So the improvement of the medical care facilities on the island seem to me to be extremely crucial, to not just say, oh, the island needs more physicians or better care, or better facilities, but to say that could be done in a way that is structured strategically to attempt interventions to see if they work in diminishing the incidence or prevalence of some of the illnesses that have been identified today. So at any rate,
well, John, I understand, but I would disagree, and I would disagree for this key point. If we had taken that approach, we wouldn't have collected the monoleo data that led us to understand atmospheric change. So at the same time, we have to, I absolutely agree that we need to identify some critical, high priority, immediate kinds of things. But you also, I urge you to consider what are the investments now in monitoring that may not pay off in 3 years or 5 years. But as that next generation of Viequenses appears, and you go 7 generations out, you've got a foundation of science for long-term work. The other I would say, and I meant to say it in the talk, we had a whole, every conversation I've heard, the only words that haven't been used are the ones the policymakers will demand of you. They will demand it of you, and if you cannot give it to them, I have seen this, they will turn around and walk away and not listen to you. And that is, what is the certainty level? How uncertain are you? If you're making a recommendation, are you absolutely confident? Or is it plausible? Is it probable? Until you systematically assign levels of uncertainty, in the work we did on the Deepwater Horizon, where we had to give instant feedback to decision makers to make decisions of major import, we used the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel's Climate Change, their 4th policy assessment, uncertainty scale. But every word we had, every time we made a pronouncement about this might be the health effect, or this might be the nutritional effect, or this might be the environmental effect, we had to associate, and I urge that we here consider associating it with a level of uncertainty that can be justified in the peer review literature or elsewhere, so that policymakers are given the science, but not in the kind of absolute world, their science is bad, our science is good, but rather in the more policy acceptable realm of what's the uncertainty that we have associated with this recommendation. And here's the irony. The more honest you are about the uncertainty level, the more they will listen to you. You walk in there to the decision makers and you say, here's our science, follow it. And you're not prepared to say you're uncertain about certain things, they won't trust it. The irony is the more you are willing to identify systematically the level of certainty, the more effective you are in causing change. So the only place we really disagree is that I don't think you can just focus on high priority.
I don't think I was suggesting.
Okay. All right, then we're on the same page.
I used the word hierarchy
Okay.
of importance.
Yeah.
Identifying critical research areas.
Then we're on the same page. I agree. Yes.
I have 0 points. This is very, very interesting. This is a you're
I'm old, I apologize.
I speak very low.
I'll come really close because I want to hear.
This is a very interesting concept.
To which one can agree or disagree philosophically, politically, economically, scientifically. So I'm going to try to be succinct. In the first place, one of your 3 points about being accurate fidelity to the law. My question is what law? Because if you ask many Puerto Ricans, the mere presence of the United States in Puerto Rico and in Vieques is illegal. Okay? So what law? Okay? Which law? International law? What law? Because I have questions regarding, I was asking before, was there a lawyer in the group to explain to me what is the concept of sovereign immunity? Because I know there's one now. That's deeper than it looks.
Yes, it is.
That's deeper than the sea.
I agree with you.
Okay? Politically, it's
But-
a political and legal issue that I don't think we know. We might disagree radically. Second, it is true that islands have the disgrace of becoming, when they become nice, have population replacement. That's what happened to Hawaii. Okay? That's what happened to Culebra. And there are no Viequenses here in this room, but if there were Viequenses here in this room, true Viequenses would be very, would disagree totally and be very concerned and worried, and some of them disgusted, about the fact that their population is going to be replaced by non-Viequenses.
They would
That was-
disagree that
they
it
would
will
disagree
happen?
that-
They
yes.
think it won't happen?
But they were, and that was one of their concerns. That was one of their concerns, that they would not like Vieques to become Culebra, because they did not want to lose Vieques, because Vieques was theirs, and that
Mhm.
land was stolen from them,
Mhm.
and they don't want it to be stolen from them again, and their development capacity to be stolen from them. And that was a main issue, and that's one of the reasons, that was one of the problems about the land being handed to the Fish and Wildlife, which determines what use the majority of the land is going to have in Vieques, right? And it's going to allot which land can be used by humans, which land can be used for pure wildlife, which land is sacred, and which land cannot be touched because it's too contaminated, and which land is going to be for Viequenses, which were the original owners of that land. If you, I don't know if you talk to them, but if you talk to Viequenses, you will find it, that they are very, very concerned.
Oh, yeah, I know
and very,
that.
very worried about population replacement. And I don't think we have the, it may happen.
Well, you
If
see the
forces are-
Esperanza.
Forces, I know Vieques.
Yeah.
I know Vieques, I understand. I know real estate in Vieques. But that's one of the main concerns about that population, and I think that we'll be stimulating a terrible injustice by stealing Vieques from Viequenses. I think that it's not in our power to reverse the trend, but it's not in my power to reverse the trend, but it is my responsibility as a citizen of the world to defend their land. It's not our land, it's their land. It was their parents' land, it was their grandparents' land, it was the Indians' land. There was I don't know, history, I guess those were the last Taínos
Mhm.
to give up. They killed themselves before giving up to the Spaniards. They were the last ones to defend their land, okay? And I think we stole that land from them. And we that's one of the sociological, political issues of justice that have to be dealt with. And I think that it's very, very important, going back to what law are we abiding by, to identify what are
Can I
the
respond to the law one, because I think that's an important one.
Yes.
Remember, my suggestion was not that it was a good idea that this population is replacing. My suggestion is there is a trend afoot, there's a trend going on that should be studied and understood for its implications. In terms of law, you make a good point. What law? The Fish and Wildlife Service, it's pretty straightforward. Like the National Park Service, we have to follow U.S. federal law. And you can say, I mean, for example, the very laws that several people said we're almost doing criminal activities, that there are elements of the U.S. government doing criminal activities. The only way you can say that is if you have faith in the law. how can you define the criminal activity if you don't say the law matters? Yes, the government has to be held to the law, but the government is also restricted to what it can do within the law. So that while a group of politicians or a group of Vieques who deeply believe in international law and that supersedes federal government have every right and responsibility to act on it, but if you expect the Fish and Wildlife Service, for example, to manage the refuge in ways against the law of establishing refuges, you will wait a long time and be surprised.
Do you know how many times I did trespassing in Vieques to get the samples in 1999, 2000?
Right.
Do you think they will give me permit? Not them, but U.S. Navy back then.
Understood.
So there's times that you can't follow the law.
Oh, okay.
You have to follow your responsibility.
Yes, and civil disobedience has a long history in this country, and everybody here has had their time doing it for whatever cause they care about. I understand. But to deal with the politicians, to actually cause change in the politicians, you are going to have recommendations for action that fit within accurate fidelity to all the law, social justice as well as other kinds of law.